In today's episode, let's look at how the Sherpas sensed this married couple would not make it back. Above 14,000 feet, they brushed aside the single rule even experienced climbers refused to cross. What came next was a deadly series of setbacks that changed a honeymoon climb into a cold, irreversible descent. On August 8, 2014, in the middle of the summer climbing season on the Matterhorn, a 14,692-foot peak between Switzerland and Italy, the Hernley Ridge, the usual path to the top, saw steady traffic that day, which was common for that time of year. Early conditions were calm, with open skies and moderate wind. By afternoon, forecasts predicted dropping temperatures and rising gusts, a normal pattern for late summer in the Alps. Thomas Meyer, 35, and Anna Meyer, 32, were on the Matterhorn during their honeymoon. They had reached Zermatt earlier that week and selected the route because it was familiar and often completed in one push. Their small child remained at the hotel with a paid caregiver while they made their summit attempt. Friends said Thomas was highly competitive and focused on results. He trained often, monitored progress carefully, and set goals with clear endpoints. Achievement meant finishing, not turning close to the end. Over time, this strengthened his trust in preparation and supported the view that limits could shift if enough work had already gone in. Anna was described as just as driven, but centered on shared success. She valued reaching goals together and recording their trips to mark the experience. Neither Thomas nor Anna was considered careless. They organized the climb in advance, carried proper gear, and hired Sherpas for assistance. These steps showed planning and caution. At the same time, they supported the belief that the ascent was managed, which made time limits feel adjustable instead of firm. They moved with two Sherpas who set the pace, directed the route, and helped manage the descent. From the beginning, they were slower than planned. The pair stopped often, and congestion on the ridge created delays. The Hernley Ridge tightens through repeated rock and ice sections, where only one climber can pass at once. So even short pauses caused lines that disrupted the overall timing. The Matterhorn follows a strict 2 p.m. turnaround guideline because descent relies on daylight. The route is not a single marked trail, but a chain of down climbs, brief crossings, and rappel points that must be identified by sight. In clear light, climbers spot ledges, anchors, and safe lines through small shifts in color, texture, and angle. As sunlight leaves the ridge, those features fade and become difficult to distinguish. As daylight starts to weaken, progress becomes slower. Working the rope takes more time, because every move must be double-checked. Protection points are harder to spot, since many sit in the rock and can only be seen from certain angles. Every brief stop adds minutes, and those minutes stack up. Headlamps brighten the space in front of a climber, but they limit side vision and depth, making it easier to miss an error before putting full weight on the line. This is the condition the turnaround rule is designed to prevent, when getting down depends more on the clock than on ability. By late morning, the team was already behind that plan. Thomas and Anna paused often to catch their breath, and they stopped to take pictures and short recordings along the ridge. Each break seemed minor alone, but together they extended the ascent beyond what was expected. After every stop, they had to clip in again, wait for room ahead, and merge back into the steady line of climbers on the route. Higher up, the ridge became tighter with traffic. Some stretches allowed only one person to pass at a time. Brief down climbs and fixed rope segments created slow points, forcing climbers to stand by while others cleared the section. On their own, these waits were small. Over hours, they built steadily, making the lost time harder to regain as the summit drew nearer. Around 1:45 p.m., Thomas and Anna were still short of the top. By then, they were already outside the schedule needed for a return in daylight. The Sherpas later said this was when the climb should have stopped. They pointed to the hour, the fading light ahead, and the distance required to reach the Hernley hut safely, and recommended turning back. Those present described the conversation as measured and controlled. The Sherpas did not shout or signal panic. Thomas and Anna listened, but kept their direction. They moved upward at the same steady speed. Nearby climbers remembered the pair stopping again not long after, filming and taking photos with the summit just above. Nothing in the surroundings demanded an urgent choice. Conditions were steady, the sky remained clear, and the path above appeared unchanged from earlier. Other climbers were descending, some noting the hour as they passed. Thomas and Anna heard them, but continued higher. According to the Sherpas, the couple hoped to stand on the summit together and record the moment during their honeymoon. The ascent went on. From there, the question was no longer whether they could reach the top, but how much light would remain for the way down. The time usually available to handle slow spots, crowding, or small slips was shrinking. Even as the mountain appeared calm, the summit was near, the weather still stable, and the goal within view, which made pressing on seem reasonable at that time. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, long shadows covered the rock, contrast faded, and small features became harder to see even before full darkness arrived. There was still no clear hazard, but the margin for a safe descent was narrowing. Thomas and Anna stepped onto the summit a little after 3 p.m., more than 60 minutes beyond the agreed turnaround. Other climbers reached the top, snapped brief proof photos, and began their descent without delay. Thomas and Anna remained. Their packs came off, layers were adjusted, and more photos and short clips were recorded at the peak. The Sherpas kept checking their watches as the light slowly weakened. Far below, the descent line was already sinking into shade, and the remaining daylight was being used at the highest point. The summit still felt clear and steady, but the way down was becoming harder to see. The descent opened with steep, open stretches where climbers must choose footholds and clip into anchors with care. These moves are simplest in strong daylight. When they finally started down, the sun had already slipped behind the ridge, and the glow was fading before headlamps were required. As they continued downward, the light kept dropping. They moved with caution, but visibility fell enough that they switched on headlamps at the first main anchor. From there, they could see only a narrow circle ahead. The broad outline of the ridge disappeared, depth became harder to judge, and every anchor needed a slow check before taking weight. The wind strengthened and the air cooled further. Fingers lost heat quickly, gloves stiffened, and basic rope tasks required more time. Each stop and changeover lasted longer than earlier. Nothing failed at once, but the minutes kept stacking up. Crowding added pressure. Climbers ahead spent extra time at rappel points, forcing those behind to wait. Those pauses occurred on steep, exposed ground with nowhere to rest. The descent stayed controlled, yet there were fewer safe areas to pause without hanging fully on the line. By the time they moved past the upper section of the Hernley Ridge, full darkness was settling in. From then on, progress relied entirely on headlamps, fixed anchors, and selecting the correct path in low light. The mountain had not shifted, but the margin for error had narrowed. What felt controlled in daylight now demanded steady, non-stop focus. There was still no clear crisis. The route felt known, anchors stood where expected, and the system remained in place. That created a sense of control, even though daylight and time were no longer there to absorb mistake. Full darkness settled while Thomas Meyer and Anna Meyer were still high on the ridge. Headlamps became the only light, shrinking focus to the rock just ahead. Each step demanded more energy, and every changeover slowed. The path tightened into mixed rock and ice, and in the dark, the anchors seemed closer than they had hours earlier. The group followed rope lines that roughly matched the descent track, staying clipped in and depending on what climbers before them had fixed. Delays grew as those ahead spent longer at each anchor. Waiting became unavoidable, often on steep, exposed terrain. Wind pushed fine snow through the beam, flattening contrast and hiding surface detail. They kept moving, but progress felt slower and more confined at every station. As temperatures fell, handling ropes and metal hardware became harder. Gloves stiffened, cold spread through carabiners and devices, and actions that had been simple earlier now required thought and time. Rope feeds dragged, clips took longer, and each transfer extended the descent. Nothing failed outright, but the pace narrowed bit by bit. Crowding along the ridge began shaping the way down. Climbers lingered at anchors, building backups that stretched groups apart and disrupted the normal flow. In one tight section, a climber above slipped while stepping off an anchor, dropping several feet before the rope caught. No injury followed, but everyone paused to inspect and reset the system. Movement resumed, yet the delay deepened the queue. As the weight increased, attention shifted to keeping momentum. To limit longer stops, many, including Thomas and Anna, moved along rope lines already under load. Remaining clipped in and clearing bottlenecks took priority over confirming the broader line. The ropes seemed to track the expected descent, but not always the exact daylight route. These minor shifts were hard to detect in darkness. Headlamps illuminated only narrow strips of stone, and focus stayed on the next immediate hold. Small sideways drifts added up, as climbers chose the path that moved fastest through congestion, instead of the precise track used earlier. At one station, Thomas stepped forward to find the next anchor, setting himself just below it, while still secured. His beam caught a rope dropping into black space where the descent usually continued. The anchor appeared firm and carried tension, suggesting others had relied on it earlier that night. As Thomas began his rappel, his full weight transferred onto the rope, and it shifted a few inches across the rock. The movement was slight and did not stop his descent. The line continued to feed through his device, and the anchor above remained solid. With climbers positioned both above and below him, the priority was keeping the line moving and avoiding further delay, rather than pausing for a full reset of the system. Nothing appeared wrong. The rope stayed under tension. The anchor did not move. Several climbers had already descended the same stretch without incident. From every visible sign, the setup looked dependable. What could not be seen was how the rope's contact point had changed little by little with each transition. Every weighted handoff, combined with fading daylight and repeated loading, guided the rope closer to rock features normally avoided when visibility was clear. Under headlamps, depth and texture flatten. Rounded stone and sharp edges can look nearly identical, especially when coated in a thin film of ice. The rope kept sliding as designed, but the margin around it was shrinking without anyone recognizing it. By the time the rope brushed the concealed edge, the process had already been building for several minutes. There was no single obvious error. Instead, a chain of small decisions: continue moving, maintain spacing, avoid stopping in the cold, kept the descent flowing as darkness, wind, and congestion narrowed options. The line had migrated just enough for friction to become a growing factor. When Anna descended after Thomas, the rope shifted again under her load. The contact point crept slightly upward along the rock face. A thin glaze of ice softened the appearance of the surface while increasing resistance. The rope began to drag more noticeably, and her descent slowed. The rappel paused briefly. Wind noise and distance limited clear voice contact, but intersecting beams of light showed positions along the face. A minor adjustment was made to help the rope feed more smoothly. The resistance eased slightly. They continued. As weight returned to the system, the combined load pressed the rope harder into the stone. The line settled into a shallow groove formed by repeated seasonal use. Friction increased further. The rope no longer ran freely, and each movement required more control. Below the anchor, the slope dropped sharply. There were no level ledges where the team could stop, rebuild, or fully inspect the contact point. Each foothold was angled and exposed. Once Thomas moved beyond the anchor zone, climbing back up against gravity and traffic was no longer realistic. From that stage forward, the descent had only one direction. The fixed rope already in place was the only workable path, even as the system became less tolerant of error with each meter. Climbers higher on the face later stated they noticed the rope tug slightly sideways as it crossed the rock. The angle shifted just enough to focus pressure onto a narrow strip of stone. With each controlled step, friction intensified at that point. The ice covering the surface made it appear smooth and uniform. Under artificial light, no damage to the rope could be detected from above. The Sherpas described the rope's motion as uneven. It would move, hesitate, then move again. That pattern often signals contact with a rough edge rather than a flat surface. In daylight, it can be caught early. At night, when anchors remain stable and nothing appears loose, it blends into normal descent noise. As Thomas continued lower, the rope carried his full body weight without relief. The fibers at the contact point had been under repeated strain for several climbers before him. The system had been working within limits. Now it was approaching them. The tugging grew slightly sharper. The rope fed again. Then, under sustained load, the outer sheath began to fail at the unseen edge. Climbers above described the break as immediate. The load disappeared without notice. Thomas separated from the wall and fell straight for several feet before the slope pushed him outward. He left the reach of the headlamps almost at once as the ground steepened below. There were no shelves, no interruptions, nothing to slow him. The fall traced the mountain's natural fall line and faded into the dark. Anna stayed higher, still attached to the upper length of rope. When the tension released, the loose end snapped upward, hit the rock with a sharp crack, then dropped quiet. The anchor stayed in place, but the rope was cut. The single system that allowed a steady descent no longer functioned. Everyone above froze. Small rocks and pieces shaken loose by the break began sliding downhill, scraping as they moved. Several climbers and Sherpas said they heard debris for seconds after Thomas vanished. The falling stones made it unsafe to edge closer or lean out to look. Past the last point of light, there was no movement and no sound. Anna hung just above the broken section. With part of the rope gone, she could not descend farther. Climbing upward was not possible without help, and the rock within reach offered no firm grip. Below her, the face dropped sharply, giving no place to rest or shift her weight. From the anchor above, the Sherpas evaluated the problem. To reach Anna, they would have to cross the same rock edge where the rope had parted. That section was still partly iced, and its shape was hard to judge in limited light. The Sherpas later said that placing a new rope over that edge carried a serious risk of another cut, especially with more load and poor visibility. The investigation supported that view. Safely rebuilding the setup would have required a longer rope to approach from a new angle and bypass the damaged edge. No rope long enough was stored at that point. Without it, the system could not be lengthened or adjusted to allow a controlled descent. Minutes went by without chain. The air grew colder as the night settled in, and the wind struck harder along the ridge. Warmth drained quickly from every exposed surface. What started as a slow descent had turned into a problem, with no quick answer. Anna remained suspended against the face, clipped to the last intact section of rope. The anchor above her had not moved, but the system was no longer whole. With the lower section gone, descent was no longer an option. The wall beneath her dropped away without a shelf, crack, or platform where she could stand or rest her weight. The Sherpas stayed positioned above the anchor for self-protection. To reach Anna, they would have to cross the damaged section again, exposing themselves to the same hazard. The ridge higher up narrowed into uneven rock and thin snow patches, offering no flat ground to rebuild the system or create a stronger stance. There was no wide ledge to work from. No extra margin built into the terrain. Wind began to push harder across the ridge. Gusts pressed clothing against rock and tugged at loose straps. Temperature continued to fall with the loss of daylight. From their position, the Sherpas could see Anna making small adjustments, shifting her hips and feet to keep balance against the wall. Each controlled movement transferred uneven force into the remaining rope. What had been a shared load was now concentrated on a shortened line and a single anchor point. They attempted to reduce stress on the damaged section by transferring part of the load to a secondary anchor. One Sherpa moved carefully under a narrow beam of headlamp light, testing each foothold before committing weight. Every carabiner was clipped and unclipped in sequence to avoid shock loading the system. Snow grains drifted sideways in the light, and small ice flakes broke loose from above, tapping against helmets and sliding down the slope. The rock surface was inconsistent, firm in some spots, hollow in others. The system held during the adjustment, but the margin was gone. There was no redundancy left, no backup line below. As tension shifted, the remaining rope edged slightly across the rock near the anchor. The movement appeared minor. However, the contact point had changed. A thin film of ice covered the stone, masking the shape of the rock beneath. In the limited light, the edge looked rounded, but it was not. Anna pressed her crampons into the wall to stabilize herself. One front point scraped and failed to catch. Her weight shifted abruptly. The sudden drop in her stance sent a sharp load through the rope. The anchor did not fail. The rope moved under the force, dragged across the concealed edge. Friction built instantly. The sheath tore first. Then the core strands separated. The line parted. Anna fell away from the anchor and into open space. She struck the rock face, then continued down the fall line of the ridge, disappearing beyond the visible slope. Above, no one spoke. Small rocks dislodged by the break slid downward, scraping against stone. The terrain made it unsafe to lean over and look. The section below the anchor could not be accessed without installing a new fixed line, a process that required daylight and stable footing. The ridge above remained too narrow to bypass the break. The site was cut off from both directions. Radio contact was established with mountain rescue. The message confirmed that 2 climbers had fallen during descent, and that entry to the area was not possible in current conditions. Any action was deferred until the morning. After the second fall, the Sherpas clipped in at the anchor and restricted movement to essential safety steps. Wind pushed light snow across the ridge, but the weather held steady. Time moved slowly, with no improvement. Throughout the night, regular checks showed no activity below the anchor. Headlamps scanned the slope without signal or reply along the drop line. Given the angle of the terrain and the distance involved, focus gradually shifted from rescue to recovery planning as daylight approached. The mountains stayed quiet overnight. Temperatures remained under freezing, slowing snow shifts. Winds changed direction but never reached levels requiring relocation. Nothing in the dark reduced the danger of entering the fall zone. At first light, features along the Hernley Ridge became visible again. Rock edges, fixed anchors, and sections of the descent line came back into focus. The site of the falls remained steep and open. Even in daylight, the slope did not permit a fast or direct approach. Rescue crews were updated as visibility improved. Night reports placed the incident high on the ridge and indicated rope failure during descent. Coordinators evaluated the face and held back access until movement could occur without adding risk. While coordination continued, the Sherpas stayed clipped above the failed anchor and avoided the damaged span. Once communication was steady and a plan confirmed, they climbed higher to secure ground, clearing the broken section and lowering further exposure. Recovery crews moved up from below along the normal route. Shifting stones, patches of ice, and the sharp incline slowed their advance. As they gained height, the fall path became visible. Gouged rock, loose gear, and torn rope pieces formed an unbroken line down the wall, showing where gravity had pulled both climbers after the system gave way. That line ended at the two climbers. One body lay higher on the ridge, pressed against a rock ledge. The position indicated a long drop followed by repeated impact. The second body was found farther down the same track, spaced apart in a way consistent with several strikes on steep ground. Both were declared dead at the site. Fixed ropes were set to stop further shifting during recovery. Gear was documented and cataloged before removal. Retrieved rope sections showed heavy wear, with strands cut through where the line had scraped across stone. Examination confirmed the anchors were secure and properly set. The breakdown did not begin with faulty gear. The rope had been severed by friction against a sharp rock edge concealed under a thin layer of ice, a known risk during nighttime descents. Weather data showed steady conditions during the ascent, followed by normal cooling late in the day. There were no sudden shifts. Route review showed the 2 p.m. turnaround limit had been passed, forcing the descent into darkness. Investigators determined the rope break was not the true point of no return. That moment came earlier, when the team chose to continue beyond the cutoff. Once the descent relied on headlamps, recovery margin was gone. The Sherpas' presence did not alter the result once full night conditions settled in. Terrain, timing, and system limits defined what could be done. No rule violations were assigned to them. Their cautions were based on schedule, not emotion, and the review confirmed those cautions were valid. What made the event especially risky was how routine it felt for most of the climb. Each choice, remaining slightly longer, following an existing line, wading through crowding, seemed reasonable alone. Together, they erased daylight, alternatives, and every remaining backup. Plans were arranged for the care of the couple's child, who had stayed at the hotel during the ascent. The incident was later presented in alpine safety briefings as a case of descent-driven hazard. No route modifications followed. Climbers returned within days. The Matterhorn remained unchanged. Its limits stayed the same. The Sherpas sensed the couple would not return safely, not because the slope appeared extreme, but because the clock had already expired. And on that ridge, lost time cannot be restored by any system once it slips away. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand how small decisions turn into irreversible outcomes, watch one of the videos on screen next.